Welcome back, Left Reckoners. David here. I'm really excited to be joined by Sohrab Ahmari, who is the founder and editor of Compact Magazine. But we're not going to be talking about Compact too much today. We're going to be talking about his new book, Tyranny Inc., which actually has just gone live as this will be premiered on Tuesday, the 15th. Thank you so much for spending some time today on Left Reckoning.
David, thank you for having me.
No, really, I'm really excited to talk to you. I mean, I read the book. It's a really interesting text, and I want to dive into it a little bit. But just for people who aren't familiar with you, I mean, you would consider yourself to be a man of the right, correct?
Yes, I was a leftist when I was a high schooler, and in college I was a Trotskyist. So I have a complicated ideological history, but I gradually migrated to the right, but a specific corner of the right, which is shaped by Roman Catholicism, which is why on economic issues, as readers will see, I kind of depart pretty drastically from the conventional conservative movement.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I sort of wanted to get at before we really dive into the book, and I think it'll become clear to people as we go through some of the arguments that you make in the text, because I really enjoyed the book, particularly the introduction. I thought was really clever. It tricked me, it got me. It was a good move there. But you know, to me, it doesn't read too much as a conservative book. It's very materially rooted. And before we dive into like the actual text, I wanted to ask you, why do you think this perspective that you lay out in this book might be unique compared to other thinkers on the right, or do you think it's not that much of a departure from typical modern U.S. conservatism?
Well, it isn't conservative if by conservatism we just mean preserving whatever the current arrangements in society are. But if you think conservatism should be about, making it easier for people to just live ordinary lives of dignity and safety and comfort, then that means you need a conservatism that tackles the sort of tyrannies that are generated by the unhindered market system on their own. So it's a kind of reformist conservatism. And in that sense, there is something of an American tradition stretching back to the Jacksonians and then forward to Teddy Roosevelt, and then the reception of the New Deal by like Eisenhower and Nixon, that they, these figures all realized that the kind of unregulated capitalism of the 19th century and early 20th century was in need of reform. And so they came to embrace, progressivism in the case of Teddy Roosevelt with all of its flaws, et cetera. And then the New Deal in the case of figures like Ike and Eisenhower. It's non-conservative relative to the Reaganite ascendancy that we've become accustomed to since the 1980s, which is hyper neoliberal and radically favors the assetless few at the expense of radically favors the asset owning few at the expense of the assetless many. That was needlessly cumbersome to say. And so, yeah, I mean, I would say that the book is actually born of a place of frustration on my part. I was one of those people who, at first being a little bit befuddled by befuddled and angry about the Trump phenomenon, I came to see why a lot of ordinary working class people were embracing Trumpism. And what stood out about Trump was his opposition to a lot of neoliberal policies. Now, whether he actually implemented a post-neoliberal program is a different question. But a lot of the right continues to have this tendency of lamenting various cultural phenomena. People aren't getting married. People are alienated. There is an opioid crisis, but they never link these cultural phenomena to their material roots. Like it's just a cultural thing. People have the wrong ideas. So if we just tell them the good ideas, society will repair itself. And that's, plainly not the case.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good time to sort of dive in to some of the arguments that you lay out in the book, particularly the title of it, Tyranny Inc. I mean, could you give people a sense of what you mean by Tyranny Inc, and then maybe we can go into some of the examples of I don't know, the unfreedom that people experience on a regular basis, in fact, in the vast majority of their lives.
Yeah, David, there have been a number of books about corporate power coming from the right in recent years. What they typically will focus on is the fact that some companies adopt progressive cultural stances, and that's all they target. That is not the kind of book this is, as you know, having read it. Rather, by Tyranny Inc., I mean a systematic profusion of coercive practices in the private economy, in our lives as workers and consumers, that envelops all of us. And precisely because these realms of life, like the workplace and the marketplace, are treated as quote unquote private by our system, they are removed from political contestation. From we're used to think of a good society as one in which we are able to democratically contest the big issues, where there's give and take. If there's wrongdoing, it's justiciable in the courts. We can have our day in court, etc. None of that, increasingly, none of that applies to the private economy, which just happens to be where most of us spend most of our time. It's where we shop. It's where we work, which means we spend most of our waking hours as adults at the workplace. And that just happens to be the place where we are told not to expect, democracy, give and take, accountability, etc. That place is it's totally okay to be subjected to coercion. And that's it. And so that's the thesis of what Tyranny Inc. is. When you add up all these forms of coercion, which aren't like state-directed government coercion that we're used to being alert to, but rather much more sinister, in fact, and sort of insidious, invisible forms of coercion. When you add all that up, you get what I call a system of private tyranny.
Yeah, I mean, so, I want to get into some of these particular examples, and I know this might seem like a really basic question, but when, a lot of people on the left sometimes struggle with this and certainly see this on the right. So I want to ask you just bluntly, what is the difference in your mind between like public and private power? Because sometimes people think that these can be sort of disentangled neatly, and a lot of times there is a connection here.
Well, I'm of the school that sees them as being just inextricably bound up with each other and impossible to disentangle. First of all, the kinds of private coercion that I talk about has eminently public consequences, right? So, for example, half of American fast food workers have to rely on public welfare to make ends meet because their wages are insufficient. A quarter of college adjuncts have to rely on public welfare to make ends meet. So our nation's wage policy, what wages are set by large employers, for example, in the service economy or the service industry, has eminently public consequences, because when they set wages too low, the rest of us as taxpayers end up subsidizing their greed. So it's very difficult at the level of the consequences to disentangle what public and private are. But even more, clearly in some ways, at the level of the causes, the public and private are deeply bound up with each other. Obviously, the corporate form itself is famously a creature of the state. The corporation exists because of a particular sort of legal arrangement that emerged in the 19th century. And we can get into the history of that in the prior to the Jacksonian era. For the most part, corporate charters were granted on a very limited basis by state governments for a specific rendering of a public good. It was only after the Jacksonian era, and in some ways it was a democratization, but in some ways it has saddled us with something worse. In the aftermath of the Jacksonian era, anyone could just charter a corporation just to make a profit, which went against the public good orientation of the original corporate form. But just to say, one tiny example, the corporation, which we, are especially conservatives treat as this sort of autonomous natural being, is not. Of course, it's not. It's a creature of the state. Our bankruptcy laws, whether or not we intervene in capital markets, all of that is state-driven and state-directed in some ways. Even when the state chooses not to intervene in something, that itself is ultimately a political decision. So this illusion of thinking of certain things as sort of absolutely private and other things as absolutely public is a great hindrance to reforming some of our major problems.
Yeah, I mean, so let's look at some of the contemporary moment right now when it comes to capitalism and work for people. I mean, one of the arguments that you sort of, I think, skewer in this in your text is, I mean, typically, like you see this all the time. You know, I'm in Texas, and there's a lot of horrific labor violations that people experience. Notably, for example, right now there's this big fight over water breaks, whether or not people working outside in 105-degree weather deserve to be able to drink water and get shaded. A typical response that I'll get from Republicans that I know or conservatives will be like, "Well, if you don't like that job, you can just go and get another one." So there's this kind of thesis that, you're going into a contract as equals with an employer and an employee. But if you look at the totality of modern capitalism and what life is like in this country, that kind of thought experiment level understanding of that relationship is a little bit inaccurate, in my opinion. But I'm curious if you want to give your take on that.
No, it's absolutely illusory. First of all, I mean, there are two bases typically put forward by conservatives, conventional conservatives, for why they should uphold what's called the doctrine of liberty of contract, which in its classic telling says that employer-employee relations are generally optimal and therefore should not be interfered with. The first one is that both sides have a mutual right to walk away from each other. So, I can take a job and I can leave a job, and likewise the employer can give me a job or it can fire me for whatever reason, and this creates a symmetry. But of course, ordinary people know, like, that's not how most of us experience joblessness. We can't just say, "Oh, well, you handed down a new term that says I'm going to now be like surveilled 24/7 in my online use. Therefore, can I negotiate this? Oh, no, then I will get another job." It doesn't work like that, because the worker is much more dependent on the employer than the other way around. So if you voluntarily leave your job, you're not entitled to unemployment insurance, whereas the employer has all sorts of options for hiring other people, because in a given labor market, there are usually far fewer employers than there are employees. So that symmetry is a formal symmetry, true, but in reality, it's a pretty hollow symmetry. It's not actually the case. The second basis that defenders of the kind of liberty of contract model will bring up, besides the fact that you can walk away from a job, is the fact that there is just, and it's related, is that there's just tremendous competition, right? So that there's many employers and many employees, and this competition between them means that no one who wants a job will be left without one. And there's always, again, you can always find a better deal elsewhere. And likewise, they insist wages are just like a perfect crystalline expression of where supply and demand meet each other. That was kind of true in the late 18th century, when you had, lots of yeoman farmers and artisans, mechanics. They're all independent, and they all own their own tools. But ever since the 19th century, as Marx obviously taught, but plenty of other figures, wised up to this in the 19th century, lots of Jacksonians did, who weren't necessarily Marxist. The problem was that, in reality, most markets are dominated by very few employers. And when that's the case, then the wage, which is the price of labor, is not this perfect, optimal expression of, supply and demand. Rather, it's a relative index of bargaining power between the two sides. So in all these cases, we just see that that defense that your conservative friends, and certainly my conservative friends, I know a lot of them, and I'm on this side of the debate in some ways, is illusory. Like, the market has not worked that way since the mid 19th century, and yet a lot of conservative ideology about how labor markets work, the assumption is that we're still in. It's as though we're still in the late 18th century, in the age of independent yeomans and mechanics. Mechanics.
No, I mean, just coming from my experience, I used to work in the service industry when I was going through school, and I'll never forget one time, a coworker making, correct criticisms of the scheduling practices that we were experiencing. And the boss just pulled out this big binder filled with resumes and threw it on the table and says, if you don't like it, I'll just flip through this kind of thing. Right. So the idea of these people being equals in this conversation is pretty absurd. I want to talk a little bit about like the courts and corporate power and financialization. But before we get there, one thing that you sort of write about, particularly with scheduling, but is sort of like throughout your work, is not only how this system is bad for workers in the sense of low paid wages, abuses on the job site, all that kind of stuff. But how it's really, really difficult for people to have a family or for a mother to care for their child if they don't have this say, for example, in their scheduling in particular, but across the board, that this private tyranny that's you experience like at the workplace also like bleeds over into the rest of your life as well.
Yeah, totally. So, the service industry is large and ever increasing in size since the decline of manufacturing, and in the service industry and restaurant business and retail, a third of workers nowadays get less than a week's notice of what their upcoming schedule can be. Also, there are all these practices that are designed to reduce labor costs to a minimum during periods of low demand. So, for example, constantly scheduling you, but then taking away the shift, or scheduling you for what's called clopening shifts, which is the worker comes in just for the first 2 hours after opening of the shop, and then again 2 hours at the end of the shop. Well, that makes a chaos of people's ordinary lives because people have kids, they have elderly parents they need to take care of, etc. So when you sort of do that with their schedule, they have no sense of certainty. And again, to go back to the cultural issue, a lot of conservatives say, kids are having issues because parents don't spend time with them. Well, on the lower rungs of the labor market, it's because, no one has any sense of certainty about what their schedule is like. And this didn't used to be the case. This is, sociologists of labor document that this is a relatively recent development. It's like one more neoliberal turn of the screw where it used to be that the costs associated with periods of low demand, whether you're at a restaurant or a retail shop, whatever, were borne equally by both sides, right? Like, I'm going to schedule you Monday, Wednesday, and Friday and Saturday. And sure, okay, Saturday you showed up and demand was low. You got less tips and I got less in sales. Fine, whatever. But we both kind of share the downside between employer and employee. But by making it in this way, using algorithmic human resources scheduling and these kinds of practices where it's like the absolute minimum labor expended based on periods of low demand, it's good for the employer, but it just makes a hash of people's personal lives. And so workers who are subjected to this, again, studies show, are, their kids are much more likely to have tantrums in school, for their kids to feel feelings of guilt, for their kids to not perform well at school, et cetera. And it doesn't take, a genius to connect the dots. If they don't get to have dinner with mom or dad or whatever in a regular basis to have conversations, people tend to do worse. Kids tend to do worse developmentally.
Yeah, and a big surprise there. I mean, before we get to some of the solutions and the things that you sort of advocate toward the end of the book, I want to talk a little bit about financialization, and you go through particularly like the history of Sears, but like one thing that's really notable, I think, about modern capitalism is how so much of corporate culture might be the wrong word. So much of the corporation is like purely as like a financial instrument, right? And oftentimes that means might be really good for some shareholders out there, but for the people who work in different corporations, this can be something that's really, really devastating. For people who've given their career to a company that is now seeing it sort of being raided by a bunch of, private capital firms. I mean, could you talk a little bit about the development of financialization in America?
Sure.
Capitalism?
I mean, I tell this story through the life of a guy named Bruce Miller, whom I met, obviously, when I started reporting the book, who had given 35 years of his life to Sears, which used to be perhaps the most storied brand in American capitalism. And he was, he did well with Sears, and they did well by him for a long time. He was able to buy his house, buy a truck, and he was just a stellar employee and would do extra work, and they would reward him for the extra work. Managers were, but then Sears faced competition from Walmart and Kmart, and the firm had invested too much in these other non-core businesses. Like, we think of Sears as a store, but at some point Sears adopted this strategy called socks and stocks, which meant they were in real estate, they were insurance, they actually developed an early form of the internet. They became a conglomerate, and they didn't invest enough in their core business until it was too late. But that wasn't the only reason Sears has now gone bankrupt, right? In fact, that was a minor factor. The major factor was that in its early distress at the turn of the millennium, a guy named Eddie Lampert, who's a hedge fund guru, a hedge fund guy, bought Sears and did what a lot of Wall Street types do when they take over a firm, which is to manage it for cash flow. And what that means is the bottom line is that you try to just extract as much cash as you can. So what he would do, for example, is he would buy a lot of the properties the Sears stores sat on, which the Sears owned. He would buy it from Sears and then rent it back to Sears and pocket the rent money. Also, he had all sorts of bizarre sort of ideas inspired by Ayn Rand about how to manage the company, so that he divided the company into gazillion divisions, and all of the divisions were in competition with each other, so that, you know, the appliance division would actually bill the other next door retail section for services provided. And this was his idea of like ultra competitive capitalism, making the firm more efficient. What he really was doing was just asset stripping it, so that by the end of his tenure, Sears was bankrupt, and Bruce Miller lost his home, lost his healthcare, lost his job. And this is a problem in the wider economy with what you call financialization. It's the takeover of the real economy, where, you know, we build stuff or do stuff that ordinary people can recognize as a useful thing, and increasingly subject that part of the economy to Wall Street, which is just moves money around. And the added effect really is just, shifting assets from the real economy into their own asset ledgers. It's asset stripping. I mean, it's the classic term for it. And the shocking thing is that the American corporation has been increasingly shifted toward cannibalizing itself for the sake of the financial market, right? The classic capitalist way of doing business is, you know, you have a product, you go to a bank, you borrow money, and you make some profit, and you reinvest some of that profit in your business, and then you give a sort of a dividend to your shareholders, including the bank, they've taken a risk on you. That's how most people think most firms work, and they did work that way for a very long time. That's not how the typical American corporation works today. The typical American corporation actively corrodes its own capital base, meaning not only do they don't reinvest anything in the business itself, right? In order to make sure a business continues to thrive, you have to replenish the capital stock. Okay, the buildings were down, you have to repair them or buy new ones, blah, blah, blah. They don't do that. They just keep returning money to Wall Street. And so what that does, of course, is just it means that those firms go out of business eventually, because if you don't invest in a business, it goes down. And it just means that assets are transferred from communities, from workers, et cetera, over to Wall Street. It's a widespread pattern, so that it used to be most American firms were sustainers. They would sustain themselves. Today, more than half of American corporations are eroders or corroders. They're eating away at their own capital base to service Wall Street, rather than Wall Street serving the real economy.
Yeah, I mean, an example we always talk about on the show is, dropping like the climate change implications of oil drilling and all that kind of stuff. When there was the gas prices, price crisis, and the price of gasoline, fell, and all the major corporations were basically trying to pay people just to store their gasoline. They took a big hit with like those financial interests. But then once the gas prices started rising again, what happened? You didn't see a big investment from all of that windfall profits that the oil industry was getting back into production or anything like that. They were paying dividends and just sort of sitting on their stock for a really long time. And look, again, we all know about climate change, all that kind of stuff. I'm not getting into that right now. It's just an example of how absurd and irrational the system can be, where gasoline is getting more and more expensive for everyday people. And instead of fixing that problem, these companies are literally just keeping oil in the ground.
And just to speak to my own frustration with the American right, this it's pretty typical for American conservatives nowadays in the kind of post-Trump populist age to gripe about Wall Street in just a vague way. But what they really mean is like, BlackRock is pushing woke ideology on the firms that it takes over. But in terms of actually protecting the real economy from this sort of Wall Street predation, it's, the real game in town is Senator Liz Warren. She has an act called the Stop Wall Street Looting Act, which would, for companies of a given size where it's obviously important for the community, for its workers and lots of other stakeholders, a kind of private equity or hedge fund takeover wouldn't be automatic. It would be subject to sort of community veto, basically. And that's, or outright restriction. And that's absolutely necessary. Now, obviously, they're doing away with private equity and hedge fund abuses doesn't necessarily will fix American capitalism and make it better, but it would go a long way. I mean, because the pattern of accumulation that they create, private equity and hedge funds, is really, really kind of, it's predatory for everyone else. Like private equity firms increase the likelihood of a firm going into bankruptcy by several fold. Why? Because they manage the way they do. They manage for cash flow. They lever up firms, which means they load them up with debt, first of all, to buy it. And then they don't invest in the firms. They squeeze and squeeze and squeeze. So, and that's okay for them. They might buy 10 firms and one of them goes bankrupt. Okay. Sorry. They buy 10 firms and 9 of them go bankrupt, but they make enough on the 10th one that it's all a wash and they actually do more than fine. But the average American worker can't take 10 jobs at the same time and hope that one of them works out. Most people just have one job. And so that's the pattern of accumulation that's associated with this particularly kind of predatory form of Wall Street accumulation.